The war room of the Carthelon flagship stretched across 3 levels of the massive vessel, filled with holographic displays that showed every piece of data the Empire collected over the past century about the small blue planet called Earth, and Commander Zelthor stood at the center of it all. His forearms crossed behind his back as he watched the final simulations play out before him. The numbers never lied, and the numbers showed absolute victory for 100 standard cycles. The greatest minds of the Carthelon Empire had studied humanity with an obsession that bordered on paranoia, but which Zalthar knew was simply proper military preparation, and they had watched every broadcast that leaked into space, analyzed every transmission, cataloged every weapon system that appeared in human media and military demonstrations. The humans were painfully primitive, and their fastest vessels barely reached a fraction of light speed, and their weapons still relied on chemical propulsion and crude atomic reactions, and their armor was laughable, their tactics predictable, their society fractured into hundreds of competing nations that could barely cooperate even when faced with common threats, like disease or climate. "Change, Commander, the final simulation has completed," said Tactical Officer Vinkra, her voice carrying the confidence that came from reviewing 10 million Jan combat scenarios. "Earth falls in 71.3 hours with 99.7% certainty." Zalthar clicked his mandibles in satisfaction, and the Carthelon Empire had conquered 47 star systems over 3,000 years, and every conquest had been preceded by this same methodical preparation, and every single one had fallen exactly as predicted, and Earth would be no different. The humans had revealed everything about themselves through their entertainment broadcasts alone, and they glorified violence. Yes, but in such crude and unrealistic ways, and their action films showed heroes who never ran out of ammunition, who survived impossible falls, who defeated entire armies single-handedly, and the Carthelon analysts had laughed at such obvious fiction, filing it away as evidence of human delusion rather than capability. What the analysts focused on instead were the military documentaries, the news reports, the technical specifications that human nations proudly displayed to intimidate each other. And they saw armies equipped with projectile weapons that would barely scratch Carthelon combat armor, and they saw aircraft that moved at speeds the Empire had surpassed 6 centuries ago, and they saw nuclear weapons, which were impressive for a developing species but utterly inadequate. Against proper shielding technology, the training had been comprehensive and brutal, and 50,000 Void Reapers, the elite shock troops of the Empire, had spent the last decade in simulated Earth environments, and they had learned to move through structures built to human scale, and they had practiced against replicated human weapons, and they had studied human languages, human psychology, human tactics. Every Reaper could field strip and fire every major human weapon system, and every Reaper had completed thousands of hours in urban combat simulations based on human cities, and every Reaper had killed at least 1,000 holographic humans in training. The invasion fleet itself was a testament to Carthelon military superiority, and 300 warships hung in formation around the flagship, each one capable of reducing a human city to molten slag in minutes, and the troop carriers alone numbered 50, each packed with 1,000 fully equipped soldiers, and the support vessels carried enough supplies to sustain the invasion force for years if necessary. Though simulations suggested the war would be over in day, Zalthar walked along the upper observation deck, gazing out at the assembled armada through the transparent hull and ships stretched in every direction, their running lights creating a constellation of deadly intent. And in all his years of service, in all his campaigns across the Spiral Arm, he had never commanded a force this size. It was, quite frankly, overkill, and the Empire could have taken Earth with 1/10 of this fleet, but the High Command had insisted on overwhelming force, and they wanted to send a message to the other developing species in this region of space that resistance to Carthelon expansion was futile. Display Earth, Zalthor commanded, and the view screen shimmered and resolved into an image of the target world, and it hung there, blue and white and green, so beautiful that for a moment the commander almost felt regret at what was coming. Almost population centers marked, Finker said. and red dots appeared across the continents, and major military installations highlighted and naval concentrations indicated in atmospheric defense systems. Cataloged. The catalog was almost insulting in its brevity, and Earth had satellites. Certainly thousands of them, but they were for communication and observation. It's not warfare, and they had some orbital debris from old space. Programs, but nothing that could threaten a warship, and their ground-based defenses consisted primarily of anti-aircraft guns and missile systems designed to shoot down other aircraft. Not vessels descending from orbit. They have no unified command structure, observed Science Officer Thelman from his station, and even now, with our fleet clearly visible on their detection systems, they cannot agree on a coordinated response. And the nation-states are arguing about jurisdiction and authority. Zelthair had read the intercepted communications with something approaching disbelief. And the humans were detecting the invasion fleet, and they knew what was coming, and yet they were holding committee meetings and press conferences and debates about constitutional authority. Was madness, and it was also perfectly in keeping with everything the Carthellan knew about human political systems. Their largest military force belongs to the nation called the United States, Vankra reported. And however, their equipment is spread across the entire planet in what they call military bases, and their response time to any single point will be measured in hours, not minutes. And by the time they mobilize, we will control every major population center. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, and the fleet would enter orbit and broadcast the standard ultimatum, and when the humans inevitably refused, which all species did initially, the warships would demonstrate their superiority by eliminating several military targets, and then the landing forces would secure 50 key cities across the planet simultaneously, and with their centers of government and commerce under Carthellan control. Human resistance would collapse within a day. After that came the easy part, and the Carthellan had centuries of experience and occupation, and they would install a cooperative human government, extract the resources the Empire needed, and move on, and in a generation, humans would be productive members of the Empire, contributing their share like every other conquered species. All ships report ready status, announced the communications officer, and troop carriers fully loaded and warship weapons charged, and navigation has plotted the insertion vectors. Althor took one last look at the tactical displays, and 100 years of preparation had led to this moment in 10 million. Simulations had confirmed what he already knew in his bones, and the Carthellan Empire did not fail, and the Carthellan Empire did not retreat, and the Carthellan Empire certainly did not lose to species that still used chemical rockets to escape their own gravity wells. Signal the fleet, he commanded, and his voice carried across the war room with absolute authority in all ships. Prepare for faster-than-light transition and destination, Earth orbit, and time to emergence, 30 seconds. The officers moved with practiced efficiency and across 300 ships. Crews secured for transition, and weapon systems hummed to full power, and troop carriers locked down their cargo of eager soldiers. Althor felt the familiar flutter in his organs as the faster-than-light drive spooled up and around him. Space began to twist and compress, and the stars outside stretched into lines of light. Transition in 5 seconds. Called navigation, and 4, and 3, and 2, and 1, the universe turned inside out, and when it reassembled, Earth hung before them, close enough to see the swirls of clouds across the continents, and close enough to begin the conquest, close enough to die. The Carthellan invasion fleet materialized in Earth, orbit exactly according to plan, and 300 warships suddenly occupied space that had been empty milliseconds before, and their shields glowed with barely contained energy in their weapons. Arrays turned toward the planet below like the eyes of hungry predators on the flagship. Commander Zalthor allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, and the transition had been flawless, and every ship reported optimal status, and the invasion force was positioned perfectly. Hanging over Earth like a sword ready to fall, activate broad-spectrum communications. He ordered and transmit the ultimatum in all major human languages. The message was standard, refined over centuries of conquest, and it informed the humans that their planet was now under Carthellan authority, and it gave them exactly 1 hour to surrender all military forces and begin the transfer of governmental power, and it promised that cooperation would be rewarded while resistance would be crushed without mercy. The transmission went out across every frequency the Carthalan could access, and it interrupted television broadcasts and radio programs, and it appeared on computer screens and mobile devices, and billions of humans suddenly heard an alien voice telling them their independence was over for exactly 7 seconds. There was silence and no response came from the planet below, and Zalthar began to think the humans were too shocked to reply, which often happened with primitive species faced with superior force. Then the communications officer frowned and her manipulators moved across her console with increasing confusion and commander. "We are receiving responses," she said, and multiple responses and thousands of responses. "Play the official government channel," Zalthar commanded, and expecting to hear fear or perhaps defiant bravado from whatever human leader had been designated. To speak, what came through the speakers was laughter, and actual laughter, rolling and genuine and deeply amused, and it went on for several seconds before a human voice, speaking accented but clear Carthalan, said, "You should have kept watching our broadcasts." Zalthar felt a flicker of something unfamiliar and uncertainty, perhaps, or the first touch of doubt, and explain. He demanded the human voice belonged to someone who sounded young by human standards and relaxed. "Almost casual, and you guys spent 100 years studying us, right?" the voice said, and it was not a question, and watched all our TV shows and movies and military parades, and you figured you had us all mapped out. Your point. Zalthar said coldly, "The thing about humans." The voice continued, and there was something like pity in it now, and we lie, and we lie to each other, and we lie to ourselves, and we especially lie to anyone we think might be watching, and you really think we broadcast our actual capabilities where anyone with a satellite dish could see them before Zalthar could respond. The tactical officer shouted a warning, and energy spikes across the planet, and multiple launch signatures and incoming fire. The view screen erupted with threat indicators and what the Carthalan had catalogued as communication satellites were, opening like flowers and revealing weapons platforms that had been hidden in plain sight and what had been dismissed as space. Debris was suddenly moving with purpose and accelerating with impossible speed. Rail guns fired from platforms that should not have existed, and projectiles that traveled at significant fractions of light speed crossed the distance between Earth and the fleet in heartbeats and the Carthalan. Shields were designed to deflect energy weapons, and they could absorb plasma and lasers with ease, and they were utterly inadequate against solid metal moving at relativistic velocity. The first warship died without its crew even understanding what hit them, and the kinetic projectile punched through the shield as if it was not there, and tore through the hull and exited the other side, and the ship simply came apart, spilling atmosphere and bodies and burning fuel into space. Evasive maneuvers. Zalthar screamed and returned fire, and all ships engage. The fleet tried to respond, but the Earth's weapons kept firing, and more platforms were revealing themselves, and hidden among the orbital debris and disguised as defunct satellites and built into what the Carthalan had thought were abandoned space stations, and the sky was full of metal. Moving fast enough to kill a second warship exploded, and then a third, and the Carthalan weapons. Systems were trying to lock onto targets, but the platforms were small and fast, and there were too many of them, and every second of delay meant another salvo of kinetic death shields are ineffective against solid projectiles. At this velocity, Tactical Officer Vankra reported, and her voice had lost all its earlier confidence, and "We need to exit their orbital space immediately." "Negative," Zalthar snarled, "and deploy the landing forces, and we will take the surface and regroup. And their orbital defenses cannot target us through their own atmosphere." It was sound, tactical thinking, and get the troops on the ground where Carthalan superiority in armor and training would matter, and hold territory, and force the humans to negotiate, or face devastating ground warfare. All troop carriers. Begin atmospheric insertion. Zalthar commanded, and target coordinates as planned, and establish beachheads and await further orders. 200 dropships detached from their carriers and burning through the atmosphere toward the surface of Earth, and inside each ship. Void Reapers checked their weapons and prepared for combat, and this is what they had trained for, and 100 years of preparation would not be wasted because of a few lucky shots from orbit. The dropships shook and rattled as they hit Earth's atmosphere, and heat shields glowing orange and then white in the pilots fought to maintain their vectors toward the landing zones in rural areas far from major cities, where they could establish positions without immediate, heavy resistance. 60 seconds to landing, the pilot announced over the intercom, and the Reapers stood and checked each other's equipment. One final time, and in the lead ship descending toward Montana, Strike Leader Corvin felt his blood singing with anticipation, and finally, after all the training and waiting, they would show these humans what Carthelian warriors could do. The ships burst through the cloud layer, and the ground rushed up to meet them, in forests and fields and scattered buildings that matched the intelligence reports exactly, and the landing zones were perfect and isolated and defensible. The first dropship touched down in a clearing surrounded by trees, and its ramps dropped, and Reapers poured out in perfect formation and weapons ready and scanning for threats for exactly 3 seconds. Nothing happened, and the forest was quiet except for the settling sounds of the ship and the whisper of wind through alien trees. Then, the world erupted in gunfire. It came from everywhere and nowhere, and muzzle flashes appeared in the trees, and behind rocks, and from inside buildings that were supposed to be empty farmhouses, and the Reaper's armor sensors screamed warnings as high-velocity rounds impacted there. Shield Shorvin dove behind the landing ramp as something punched through. His shoulder armor, and the pain was shocking and impossible, and their armor was rated against military-grade plasma weapons, and these were just chemical projectiles and primitive kinetic bullets, and they should not be penetrating. Turn fire. He shouted, and his squad obeyed, and energy weapons lit up the tree line, and turning wood to ash and stone to molten slag. The human gunfire did not stop, and if anything, it intensified, and a Reaper to Corvin's left jerked and fell in his helmet, shattered by a round that had come from nearly half a kilometer away, and the targeting computers said the shot was impossible, and human weapons did not have that range or accuracy. We are taking casualties. Corvin reported to the command channel and requesting immediate support, all units reporting heavy resistance. Came the reply from orbit, and Zolthor's voice was tight with anger. And hold your positions, and reinforcements are inbound, Corvin. Risked a glance around the landing ramp, and in the distance, he could see a human, and just one human, and standing in the open with what appeared to be a simple rifle, and the human fired, and another Reaper died, and the human walked calmly to a different position and fired again. They were not fighting soldiers, and they were fighting farmers and hunters and civilians who had been shooting since childhood, and who knew this terrain, and who had absolutely no fear of aliens with superior technology in Australia. Another landing force was pinned down by what appeared to be teenagers with small caliber weapons, and in Siberia, Reapers were dying to traps and ambushes set by people who hunted bears for sport. And then, for minutes after the first landing, the real military arrived, and fighter jets screamed overhead, and artillery began to fall, and special forces units, who had trained their entire careers for this exact scenario, deployed from hidden positions. Althor watched from orbit as his invasion force was systematically destroyed, and in 6 minutes of combat, he had learned a terrible truth, and humans had been preparing for this day, not for 100 years, but for generations, and they had hidden their strength and lied about their capabilities and waited, and now they were showing the Carthelian what humanity really was. Strike Leader Corvin pressed himself against the hull of the dropship and tried to understand how everything had gone wrong so quickly, and around him the Montana forest was alive with gunfire, and the thunder of explosions, and the screams of dying Reapers who had thought themselves invincible. His tactical display showed red markers everywhere, casualty reports flooding in faster than the computer could process, and of the 50 Reapers who had deployed from his ship, 23 were already dead, and the survivors were scattered and pinned down and unable to advance or even effectively return fire contact, right? Someone shouted over the com, and Corvin turned to see a human vehicle bouncing across the rough ground, and it was not a military vehicle. but some kind of civilian truck, and rust-spotted, and ancient-looking, and a human. Stood in the back with a weapon that looked too large for one person to carry. The human fired, and the weapon made a sound like thunder, and the round hit Reaper and lifted him off his feet and threw him backward, and his armor had a hole the size of a fist punched through the chest plate, and Corvin's targeting system helpfully identified the weapon as a 50 caliber machine gun, and obsolete by human military standards and in use since their 20th century. The obsolete weapon fired again, and another Reaper, dead Corvin, tried to return fire, but his energy rifle sputtered and died, and the indicator showed power cell depleted, and he had burned through a full charge in 4 minutes of combat and had killed nothing but trees, and he reached for a replacement cell in his hands. Shaking with a fear he had never felt in 2 decades of military service, the truck disappeared behind a rise in Corvin. I heard more gunfire from that direction, and then silence, and then the truck reappeared, and driving calmly back the way it had come, and the human in the back raised a hand in what might have been a wave. "They are playing with us," said Ventil, and crouched beside Corvin behind a fallen tree. "And these are not even soldiers, and where are the soldiers?" As if in answer, the sky began to scream, and Corvin looked up to see human aircraft and actual military fighters, and streaking overhead with a sound that rattled his bones, and they were not attacking the Reapers, and they were heading toward the landing ships. The dropships had some defensive capabilities and point defense weapons meant to shoot down missiles, but they were designed for space combat and not atmospheric warfare, and the human missiles came in low and fast, and weaving through valleys, and the first 3 dropships exploded almost simultaneously, and Hora watched his escape route turn into a fireball and felt something break inside him, and they were trapped on a hostile world and surrounded by enemies who seemed to be everywhere at once, and reinforcements were not coming because the reinforcements were dying just as fast as everyone else. "This is Strike Leader Corvin to any Carthilan forces. He broadcast on all channels, and we need immediate evacuation, and our position is untenable, and we are taking catastrophic casualties." The response came not from command, but from another strike leader and coordinates placing her in Australia, and evacuation is not possible, she said, and her voice was ragged, and all remaining dropships are under attack, and ground forces are being overrun. And I have lost 80% of my unit to human civilians with hunting weapons and actual children with small arms. That is impossible, Corvin said, and even as he said it, he knew it was not, and nothing about this invasion was going according to plan, and nothing matched the simulations in the Australian outback. Strike Leader Teshkala was learning the same lesson, and her unit had landed in what intelligence had called sparsely populated grazing land, and what they found instead was a population that treated firearms the way other species treated eating utensils, and as basic tools of daily life. The first humans she had encountered were 3 adolescents, and the targeting system identified them as between 13 and 16 standard years old. They had been riding motorcycles and carrying rifles, and they had killed 4 Reapers before disappearing into the brush when Teshkala's squad pursued. They found themselves in a killing ground, and the terrain was dotted with rocks and gullies, and the humans used every inch of cover with practiced skill, and they fired and moved and fired again, and her soldiers could not get a clean shot then. The adults arrived, and ranchers and farmers who had grown up shooting kangaroos and wild pigs, and they moved through the bush like ghosts, and every shot they took seemed to find a gap in Carthilan armor. Teshkala tried to establish a defensive perimeter in her training, said to secure high ground and establish overlapping fields of fire and wait for support, but the high ground was already occupied by humans with scoped rifles who could hit targets at ranges the Carthilan had not thought possible with chemical propellant weapons. Their accuracy is impossible, her second-in-command reported, and the ballistic calculations show these shots should not be connecting in wind speed and distance, and the primitive nature of their weapons should make this accuracy unachievable. Tell that to the dead. Snapped, and she fired her energy weapon at a muzzle flash and the rock where the human had been exploded, but the human was already gone and already firing from a new position. A Reaper screamed and fell, and Teshkala saw what had hit him, and not a bullet but an arrow, and an actual arrow with a metal tip, and the primitive projectile had somehow found the weak point where the helmet met the neck armor, and the Reaper was drowning in his own blood. They are using bows and arrows. Someone said in voice high with disbelief, and bows and arrows. They are using everything, Teshkala corrected. And she saw a human throw something and recognized it as an improvised explosive and fertilizer and fuel oil and materials any farmer might have, and the explosion killed 3 Reapers and wounded 5 Marin Siberia. The third major landing force was faring no better in strike leader. Mortax had landed his troops in frozen forests and thinking the cold would slow any human response, and instead he found himself facing people who lived in this cold and who hunted in conditions that would kill most species. The Russian civilians who engaged his forces moved through snow that Reapers struggled with, and they appeared and disappeared like spirits in their white camouflage, making them invisible against the landscape, and they knew how to use the terrain and where to place traps and how to funnel enemies into ambush points. Mortax watched a Reaper step on what looked like solid snow and fall through into a pit lined with sharpened stakes, and the trap was ancient and primitive and completely effective, and the Reaper's armor meant it's nothing against gravity and wood. These are not soldiers. Mortax reported to orbit, and these are civilians and hunters and farmers, and we are losing hold your position, came the response from Commander Zalthar, and reinforcements are being organized. But Mortax could see the truth in his tactical display, and reinforcements were not being organized, and they were being slaughtered. Just like everyone else, and the orbital defense platforms were still firing, and Carthilan ships were still dying, and the invasion was collapsing. And then, 5 minutes after the first landing, the real military arrived, and not the civilian defenders, but the actual armed forces of Earth in Montana. Corvin heard them before he saw them, in helicopters and dozens of them, and appearing over the ridgeline and bristling with weapons, and they did not even slow down, and rockets streaked from their pylons, and the remaining dropships exploded ground. Vehicles followed, and tanks and armored personnel carriers and artillery pieces that set up and began firing in what seemed like seconds, and the shells screamed overhead and walked across the landing zone with methodical precision. Then came the soldiers, and not conscripts or militia, but special forces and professionals who had trained their entire careers for this exact scenario, and who carried weapons specifically designed to penetrate armored targets. Corvin saw them moving through the forest and using hand signals and advancing by fire and movement and executing textbook small unit tactics, and these were not farmers with hunting rifles, and these were warriors. One of them appeared from behind a tree, barely 10 meters from Corvin's position, and the human was dressed in camouflage and face-painted and carrying a weapon with an underslung launcher, and he fired, and the projectile hit a Reaper and stuck to his armor and exploded, and the shaped charge punched through the armor. Like paper, Corvin raised his weapon and pulled the trigger, and nothing happened, and power cells still depleted, and he had not had time to reload, and the human soldier turned toward him and raised his weapon for a moment. Their eyes met, and Corvin saw something in the human's expression, and not hatred, and not even anger, and just cold, professional assessment, and like looking at prey, the human fired. Commander Zelthor stood in the war room of his flagship and watched his invasion fall apart in real time, and the holographic displays that had shown certain victory now displayed a nightmare of red threat markers and casualty reports and dwindling force strength indicator status report. He demanded, and his voice cracking with stress he had never felt before, tactical. Officer Vinecrest manipulators moved across her console, and her movements jerky and uncertain, and orbital forces reduced to 62% combat effectiveness. She said, in ground forces at 38% and falling, and no landing zones secured, and all reinforcement attempts are being interdicted by human. Aerospace forces 38%, and in 5 minutes of combat they had lost more than half their ground troops, and in 100 years of preparation, the Cathilan had never run a simulation where casualties reached even 10% in the opening phase.
How?
Zalthar said, and it was not really a question, but Vincre answered anyway. They lied to us. She said simply, and everything we studied, and everything we thought we knew, and all of it was deception, and the humans had been preparing for extraterrestrial contacts since the middle of their 20th century, and they built their defenses and hid them. And waited the view screen showed feeds from the ground and what remained of them in Corvin S. Unit in Montana was being systematically eliminated by human special forces and Teshkala's forces in Australia, were surrounded and dying, and Mortax in Siberia had stopped responding entirely. Show me their military response. Zalthar ordered, and I want to see what we are actually facing. The display shifted and showed human military forces deploying across the planet, and what Zalthar saw made his blood run cold. And these were not the parade ground units the Carthilan had studied, and these were not the equipment shown in propaganda broadcasts. The humans had hidden entire weapons systems and artillery pieces that had never appeared in any intelligence report, an aircraft that flew faster and struck harder than anything the Carthalan had catalogued, an armor that shrugged off energy weapons that should have melted it. The weapons they showed us were decoys. Science Officer Thelman said, and pulling up comparison data, and look at this, and the rifles we observed in their military parades fire a different caliber than what is hitting our forces, and the tanks we catalogued have been replaced by models with significantly heavier armor, and the aircraft we tracked were training versions and not combat. Equipped Zalthar stared at the evidence, and for 100 years, the Carthalan had watched and studied and learned, and the humans had known they were being watched and had shown them exactly what they wanted them to see. They set a trap, he said, and they have been setting this trap for a century, not just a trap, Thelman corrected. And a doctrine, and the humans have multiple facilities dedicated to studying potential extraterrestrial contact, and they have wargamed this scenario thousands of times, and they have built redundant defense systems and trained specialized forces and created contingency plans for every possible invasion strategy. The communications officer interrupted, and Commander, we are receiving multiple transmissions from Earth and military channels and civilian broadcasts and something they are calling social media. What are they saying? Zalthar asked. They are mocking us, the officer replied, and her voice small, and they are posting videos of reapers being defeated by farmers, and they are making jokes, and they are celebrating. And one transmission says, and I quote, the Carthalan discovered that rural Americans have more guns than their entire invasion. Forcehead soldiers, Zalthar, felt something like rage building in his chest, and they were being humiliated, and the Carthalan Empire did not lose, and certainly did not lose to species that had not even achieved faster-than-light travel prepare, a demonstration of force. He ordered and target a military installation, and show them what our weapons can do, and make them understand the cost of resistance, Commander. I advise against. Fenkra began do it. Zalthar snapped. The weapons officer selected a target. And a human military base in what they called Nevada, and the flagship's main cannon, began to charge and power building until the entire ship hummed, with barely contained. The weapons officer announced, the beam lanced down from orbit in coherent light, carrying enough energy to vaporize a mountain, and it struck the military base and the shields. The base should not have had, and deflected at an angle that sent the beam into empty desert impossible, Zalthar said, and they do not have shield technology, and our intelligence confirmed they do not have shield technology. They do now, Thelman said quietly. And Commander, I am detecting energy signatures consistent with Voronok design, and the Voronok we conquered 15 years ago. The humans have somehow acquired and adapted their shielding systems. The implications hit Zalthar like a physical blow, and the humans had been watching the Carthalan and studying their conquests and learning from every species the Empire defeated, and they had been preparing not just for invasion, but for invasion. By the Carthalan specifically. How long? He asked. And how long have they known we were coming? Thelman worked his console and tracking their deep space observation network, said, and they have been watching us for at least 30 years, and they knew we were studying them, and they knew an invasion was inevitable, and they used that time to prepare on the ground. The battle had shifted from confused skirmishing to organized annihilation, and human forces were not just defending anymore, and they were hunting and special forces units. Were moving through the forests and deserts and tundra and eliminating Carthalan positions with surgical precision in Montana. A reaper named Corvin had survived the initial human assault by sheer luck, and he crouched in a ravine and alone and wounded and listening to his come. Unit filled with death screams and surrender pleas, he heard boots approaching and human footsteps, and multiple contacts, and he raised his weapon and remembered it was empty and fumbled for a power cell in his hands. Slick with blood from a wound he had not even felt receiving, the humans appeared above him, and 3 of them, and dressed in woodland camouflage and carrying weapons that looked almost casual in their hands, and they looked down at him, and one of them said something in English Corviness. Translator struggled with the accent and the colloquialisms, and finally rendered it as poor. Bastard thought he could invade Montana. Another human laughed, and where did these aliens come from that they think showing up with guns in rural America is a good idea? They could have killed him, and Corvin knew they could have, but instead, one of them jumped down into the ravine and pulled out what looked like medical supplies and began treating his wounds with the casual competence of someone who had done this many times before. Easy there, big guy. The human said, and war's over for you and you get to live, and which is more than a lot of your buddies can say. Corvin did not understand and why. He managed in broken English. The human shrugged, and because we're not monsters, he said, and we're human, and there's a difference across the planet. The pattern repeated, and where Carthulan forces surrendered, they were taken prisoner. And where they fought, they were destroyed, and the human military moved with efficiency. That spoke of extensive planning and preparation in Australia. Teshkala sat among the survivors of her unit in 17. Reapers out of 200 and around them stood, human soldiers and a mix of regular military and the civilians, who had first engaged them, and one of the civilians and a teenager who could not have been more than 16 and walked past carrying a rifle that was nearly as long as he was tall, got 3 of them. The teenager said to someone, and pride evident in his voice, good shooting. An adult replied, and your grandfather would be proud, Teshkala. Realized that these people had been raised from childhood to be warriors, and that violence was as natural to them as breathing, and that the Carthellan had invaded a world where even the children were dangerous in orbit. Zalthar made his final calculation, and the invasion was over. And the question now was whether any of his force would survive to retreat all ships. He broadcast and prepare for emergency faster than light transition, and we are abandoning ground. Forces and evacuation is impossible, and all ships retreat to Rally Point Omega. The response was immediate and commander. We are locked out of our navigation systems and detecting intrusion in our computer networks, and source appears to be terrestrial on the view screen. A new transmission appeared in a young human, and barely out of adolescence by their appearance. And sitting in what looked like a bedroom, and hi there, the human said cheerfully, and United States Cyber Command here and well. Technically I'm just an intern, but I have root access to your fleet's systems now, and so here's the deal. You can surrender. You can sit here while we take apart your ships piece by piece, and your calls. Zalthar stared at the screen, and at this child who had just seized control of an invasion fleet, and who was smiling like this was all some kind of game. How? He whispered. The war room of the Carthellan flagship had gone silent, and the usual hum of activity replaced by a stillness that felt like death and commander. Zalthar sat in his command chair and stared at the tactical displays that showed the complete collapse of everything he had spent a century planning. 6 minutes, and in 6 minutes, the invasion had gone from certain victory to absolute catastrophic defeat. Commander, Tactical Officer Vienkra said softly, and we need to make a decision, and the humans are demanding our surrender, and they have control of our navigation systems, and they have weapons locked on every ship, and if we do not respond, they will begin destroying the fleet. Zalthar wanted to refuse, and wanted to fight, and wanted to order his ships to ram the planet if necessary, and to show these primitives that the Carthellan Empire did not surrender. But he looked at the numbers and saw the truth. 62% of his orbital forces were combat ineffective and destroyed, or damaged beyond function, and the remaining 38% were locked down by human cyber warfare and their weapons. Systems compromised in their shields. Failing on the ground, it was worse, and the landing forces had been reduced to less than 8,000 effective combatants out of the original 50,000. And the survivors were scattered and surrounded and cut off from support, and many had already surrendered, and the rest were being hunted down by human forces that seemed to be everywhere at once. "Open a channel to Earth," Zulthar said, and each word felt like pulling out his own organs. "And broadcast on all frequencies, and I will speak to whoever commands their forces." The communications officer worked her console and nodded, and channel open. Commander Zulthar stood and straightened his armor and tried to find some dignity in defeat. "And this is Commander Zulthar of the Carthellan Imperial Fleet," he said, "and I am requesting terms of surrender." The response came immediately, and a human voice, and female and speaking flawless. "Carthanan, this is General Sarah Chen of the United Earth Defense Force," she said, "and we accept your surrender. With the following terms, all Carthalan vessels will power down weapons and shields. Immediately, and all ground forces will cease combat operations and lay down arms, and all personnel will submit to processing as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions, in which we will explain to you, and you will provide all intelligence data regarding your empire and its military capabilities, and you will remain in custody until such time as diplomatic relations are established and reparations are negotiated." Zulthar absorbed this, and the humans were not going to simply let them leave, and they were prisoners, and the Carthellan Empire had never had forces taken prisoner before, because the Carthellan did not lose. "And if we refuse these terms?" he asked, and though he already knew the answer, "then we will destroy every ship in your fleet and hunt down every soldier on our planet," General Chen said, and her voice was flat and matter-of-fact, "and we have already demonstrated our capability to do so, and this is not a negotiation. Commander, and these are the terms, and you have 60 seconds to comply." Zulthar looked around the war room and saw the faces of his officers, and saw the same defeat and the same understanding. And they had no choice, and they had never had a choice. And from the moment they emerged in Earth orbit, the outcome had been inevitable. All ships, he broadcast, and powered down weapons and shields, and all ground forces cease combat operations, and we surrender. The response from his fleet was immediate, and relief mixed with shame and a cross. 200 surviving ships' weapon systems went dark, and shields collapsed, and Carthellan warriors who had conquered star systems put down their arms and waited for human forces to take them into custody on the ground. Corvin heard the order and felt something like gratitude, and he was alive and wounded, but alive, and the humans had not executed him when they could have, and now he would remain alive, and that was more than he had expected 10 minutes ago. Around him other reapers were emerging from hiding, and hands raised and weapons discarded, and human soldiers which moved among them, and efficient and professional, and securing prisoners with the ease of long practice, "Move along," one of the humans said, and gesturing with his rifle, and nice and easy, and nobody does anything stupid, and everyone goes home eventually. Corvin limped forward, and his leg wound sending spikes of pain with each step, and around him he could see the aftermath of the battle, and Carcelon bediz and destroyed equipment, and scorch marks on trees where energy weapons had fired in Mistay. A medic approached, and young and barely out of adolescence, and "Let me see that leg," she said, and already pulling out supplies. "You are treating me," Corvin said, in surprise evident in his voice. "That's what medics do," she replied, and began cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency. "And besides, you're a prisoner now, and we have rules about how we treat prisoners, and you'll get medical care and food and shelter, and honestly, you'll probably be more comfortable than you were on your ship in Australia." Teshkala was being loaded onto a human transport vehicle, and along with the other survivors of her unit and human soldiers, stood guard, but their weapons were lowered, and their posture was relaxed and professional rather than hostile. One of the guards was eating something in a sandwich, and he offered half to the Carthellan prisoner next to Teshkala. "And you guys eat solid food, right?" the guard asked. "And this is just peanut butter and jelly, but it's better than nothing." The prisoner stared at the offered food and uncertain, and the guard shrugged and set it down within reach. "And suit yourself," he said in a long ride ahead, and might as well eat. Teshkala could not understand these humans, and 6 minutes ago they had been killing her soldiers with ruthless efficiency, and now they were offering food and medical care, and treating them not as hated enemies, but as defeated opponents who deserved basic dignity in Siberia. The Russian forces that had surrounded Mortax's position were processing prisoners with similar efficiency, and an officer who spoke passable Carthian, explained through a translator that they would be taken to a facility and given food and water and medical attention and allowed to contact their fleet. "We are not going to torture you." The officer said, "And we are not going to execute you, and we have laws about these things, and you will be treated according to international standards for prisoners of war. And when this is all sorted out diplomatically, you will probably be returned to your people. Mortax did not understand, and we invaded your world." He said, "And we came to conquer you, and why would you show us mercy?" The Russian officer looked at him for a long moment, and because that is what separates us from barbarians. He said finally, "And we have rules, and we follow them, even when it is difficult, and especially when it is difficult, and you are defeated and disarmed, and no longer a threat, and therefore you are entitled to basic human decency." Human decency, Mortax repeated, and tasting the words yes. The officer said, "And you should learn about it, and you will have plenty of time in orbit." Zalthor was escorted from his command chair by human soldiers who had boarded via shuttle, and they were polite and professional. And they secured his weapons and placed restraints on his wrists and guided him toward the shuttle bay. "Where are you taking me?" he asked Earth. One of the soldiers replied, "And you and your senior staff will be debriefed, and don't worry. You'll be treated well and better than your troops would have treated us." I'd bet Zalthor could not argue, and he had seen the Carthian occupation protocols, and they were efficient and brutal and designed to break resistance through fear and overwhelming force in these humans. Had every right to execute him and his officers, and instead they were talking about debriefing and proper treatment. The shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere, and Zalthor saw the planet properly for the first time, and cities that glittered with lights and forests and oceans and farmland. And it was beautiful, and it was also deadly, and the Carthian had learned that lesson at terrible costs. They landed at what appeared to be a military facility, and Zalthor was taken to a room that was clean and comfortable, nothing like the cell he had expected, and a human officer entered in carrying a tablet. "Computer Commander Zalthor," the officer said, and sitting down across from him, "and my name is Colonel James Park, and I will be your primary liaison during your detention, and first things first. You and your people will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, and which guarantee humane treatment and adequate food and medical care and the right to communicate with your government, and we take these obligations seriously." "Why?" Zalthor asked, and the question that had been burning in his mind since the surrender. "Because we are civilized," Park said simply, and Beck